Welcome to session 2 of Understanding the Uniting Church. And today we're going to think about how the Uniting Church is organised. A prayer to begin our session. I invite you to join in the next couple of slides in the words that are in bold. Loving God, we come grateful for the new opportunities this day will bring, the new things you have created in our church, the new revelations of your faithfulness we shall discover, and the new life you have given us in Christ Jesus. Open our hearts to everything you would teach us. Help us to listen, to understand, to respect, and to rejoice in the many gifts we have been given. God of truth, through renewing our lives, may you renew your church in Jesus' name. Amen. So understanding the Uniting Church and all the complexities that are involved in being part of this church. In paragraph 13 of the Basis of Union, that's why I told you to turn to page 10, because it's got paragraph 13 on it. The Uniting Church affirms that every member of the church is engaged to confess the faith of Christ crucified and to be his faithful servant. And I've emphasised there every member of the church, because in case you haven't picked that up from years of sermons, that's actually part of what we're on about, that we all have a ministry and each one of us is involved in that. The church acknowledges with thanksgiving that the one Spirit has endowed the members of Christ Church with a diversity of gifts. Have a look just around this room and think about the range of gifts that are in this room. Not everyone stands up the front to say words. Not everyone sits beside the piano to play the music. Not everyone collects and counts and banks the money. But we have people that do all those things and a whole lot of others. So there's a good diversity of gifts. If you think about the people that were in this room 15 minutes ago, you've got an even bigger range of gifts. With those gifts, there comes a corresponding service. And that, of course, draws very strongly on what Paul wrote to the Corinthians centuries ago. So all ministries have a part in the ministry of Christ. That's a really strong affirmation in the Basis of Union. What this means, one important thing that this means that was articulated very strongly in the 1977 or 1976 Basis of Union, the Uniting Church will provide for the exercise by men and women of the gifts God bestows upon them and will order its life in response to God's call to enter more fully into mission. And that emphasis on men and women having gifts which they express in service, in ministry, is a very important part of the Uniting Church. In the spirit of uniting, we accept men and women as equals in every form of ministry, including in leadership. So here's a few pictures. I like that one up the top left. It's 4 or 5 years old now. That's a batch of moderators with 3 moderators and 1 former moderator with the president and the then president-elect. They're now 4 former moderators and 1 former president and the current president. So, but there was a point where each of the state leaders, many of the state leaders out of the 7, were female. And then down the bottom, another picture from 2015 Assembly, 5 of the presidents. Now, when you look at the whole list of presidents, it's very male-dominated, but in more recent times, that's starting to be rectified. So we've got 3 males, Alastair, Stuart, and Andrew, and 2 females, Deirdre and Tanner. No, not Tanner. What's her name? Forgotten her name. The doctor from Tasmania. Jill Tabber. Oh, goodness me. Yes. And I showed you this picture last week, but that's a picture of the current or about to start moderators meeting with the president of the assembly. So that's a number of state leaders and the national leader. So you can see that gender equity is important in the Uniting Church. In the next year, in the next month, this synod will have a new moderator, and that is Marta Havea Hilao down the bottom right-hand corner. Marta was elected a couple of years ago, and she takes up the role of moderator, following on from Simon Hanson, who was here a few weeks ago. And then next year, when the assembly next meets, Carissa Sooley will take up the position of president of the Uniting Church. She's currently the president-elect. Both UTC graduates in Sydney from our own synod. And
students strong.
Marta is, but not Carissa. I just missed Carissa. And as you can tell, both of Tongan origin, which is an interesting statement about the Uniting Church multicultural ministry. Just have a quick buzz with the person next to you about men and women, the mutuality. How do you view the Uniting Church's commitment to mutual ministry of men and women? And what does it mean for the way that we relate to other denominations? So two of these ministries, minister of the word, often just described as minister, and deacon, sometimes described as minister of deacon, are ordained. So that means that the church trains you, prays over you, sets you apart, and that is a lifelong, unless you put your foot into the wrong hole and misstep, that is a lifelong calling, so that even when you are no longer in a placement, getting a stipend, serving in a church, you still retain the status of an ordained person. So ordained people are recognised right across the Uniting Church. The other three categories are commissioned, and they are lay rather than ordained ministries. Lots of terminology going on here. So lay preacher, pastor, and elder are all lay people who are commissioned. In the case of, see, it's never simple in the Uniting Church. In the case of the lay preacher, you are commissioned for life. In the case of pastor and elder, you are commissioned for a particular period of time in a particular place. Okay? So it's quite different from ordained to be minister for the duration, commissioned to serve in this place, in this role.
What about life elders, John?
But in the Presbyterian Church before 1977, people were ordained as elders, and that was for life. So they still retain that status in the Uniting Church. Yeah. That's the little footnote down there. The minister of the word, this is a definition taken from my synthesizing of the regulations. The minister of the word is a minister called and trained by the church and ordained by the presbytery who preaches the gospel, administers the sacrament, exercises pastoral care, and equips the members for their ministries. So that's a basic job description for all ministers of the word. Now, what I'm going to do is put up the job description for deacon, and then we're going to compare them. A deacon is a minister called and trained by the church and ordained by the presbytery who leads the church in its mission in the community, encouraging and enabling members to serve others, especially those in need in our world. So there they are, side by side, and you can see they start exactly the same, but the functions of minister of the word and deacon are defined in different ways. One way that that's often summarised is that minister of the word is ministering to the gathered community, which is what we've been this morning. Deacon is ministering to the scattered community, to those out there that Sharon was talking about in the video. You've had 5 years of Elizabeth and you know how artificial this distinction is, and she will tell you
it's rubbish.
Thank you.
For each other's jobs. So.
Yes, yeah. So functionally, in practice, we've got ministers, we've got deacons who are ministers in placement in congregations, and we've got ministers of the word whose primary orientation is serving the community. So Anglicans and Catholics have deacon for some people as a permanent ministry, but for many others as a stepping stone, if you like, towards becoming a priest. In the Uniting Church, once you're a deacon, you have equal rights and equal responsibility as minister of word.
Yeah, this one might have missed it. So can a deacon apply to the role of a minister to a congregation?
Yeah, and they are inducted as a deacon. They don't have to change that categorisation.
They're basically interchangeable.
Yeah, yeah.
They're ever so special, but
So, Minister of the Word, here in our midst, we have Elizabeth and Sharon. People from Rainbow will remember Avril Hannah-Jones and Joe Inkpin. So that demonstrates that in the Uniting Church, gender identity and sexuality identity do not matter, that straight and gay people are ordained. And just to prove that men can be ministers too, I put my name. And we've already heard Miriam is a deacon. Does anyone know any other deacon?
Amy Kent.
Amy Kent.
Carol Davidson.
Carol Davidson.
Karen Paul down at the post.
Karen Paul, all ministers in our presbytery.
Duncan
McDermott, who was there.
all in congregation.
It says a bit about the church about not providing proper placements.
Right, moving on. A lay preacher is a lay person called and trained by the church and commissioned by the presbytery. So recognise the same kind of pattern, called and trained by the church, commissioned, not ordained, by the presbytery, who leads worship and preaches the gospel. A pastor is a lay person called by a congregation, trained and commissioned by the presbytery to lead worship, teach Christian beliefs, offer pastoral care, or engage in evangelism or service in the community. So those categories, it's a minimum of one, but you may be doing a number or more or all. An elder is a lay person called by a congregation and commissioned by that congregation to provide spiritual oversight of the congregation, building up the congregation in faith and love, sustaining its members in hope, and leading them into a full participation of Christ's mission in the world. That's what the congregation is on about.
For these non-ordained roles,
Yes.
do they require any education, like formal education?
Yes. So lay preachers need to do a series of 6 units and do some practice and be assessed on practical. Pastor is assessed in the vet type system as competencies. So there's a string of competencies to relate to each of those areas of worship. And elders
You get what you give them.
Walking and breathing, Charlie.
Elders are recognised to have gifts by their congregation. Yeah, so there's differentiations between the three, and there's different levels or extent of training required. And there are handbooks that I've used in the past years ago for elders, like training elders into what the role is. So that's one way in which the Uniting Church orders its life. The Uniting Church will provide for the exercise by men and women of the gifts God bestows upon them, will order its life in response to God's call to enter more fully into mission. So now we come to the fun bit: church, council and congregation, presbytery, synod and assembly. So they're the terms, the bodies that we're going to be thinking about now. And once again, there's no hierarchy, although I've deliberately done it in an upside down order here, haven't I? So, yeah, right. So a few things generically about church councils. Oh, I should, if you look in your books on page 11, under government in the church, the Uniting Church recognises that responsibility for government in the church belongs to the people of God by virtue of the gifts and tasks which God has laid upon them. So we are not a church where one person, like a bishop, or one group of people, like an archbishop and his bishops, are responsible for the governance of the church. But we are a church in which the people of God, we are collectively are responsible for our governance. So the Uniting Church organises this life that locally, regionally and nationally, government will be entrusted to representatives, men and women, bearing the gifts and graces with which God has endowed them for the building up of the church. And now this next infamous sentence. The Uniting Church is governed by a series of interrelated councils, each of which has tasks and responsibilities in relation both to the church and to the world. So we have a series of councils, or four types of councils that are interrelated. They are related to one another. So each council has its own distinct set of responsibilities set out. One council is not more important than another, and no council can tell another council what to do unless they are acting, this is what the regulations say, unless they are acting against the regulations of the church. Now, there are some matters like a synod might decide it wants to decide this, but the assembly says, no, you can't decide that. That's our responsibility. Or the synod, picking on the bad boy, might decide, we'd like you to do this. And the church council will say, I'm sorry, that's our area of responsibility. So, no. Now, that's the theory of it. The reality is a little bit more complex because we're human beings and relationships get complex. So each council has a designated area of responsibility. For the congregation, worship, witness and service, I mentioned that last week, they're the three important things that are set out in the basis of union, and then added to that is fellowship. When you look at how the regulations describe what a congregation is to do, we are to worship, to meet regularly, to hear God's word and celebrate the sacraments. We are to bear witness, proclaim the gospel in our daily lives. We are to serve the world locally, serve the world globally. And we are invited into fellowship, to provide opportunities for fellowship, to build one another up in love. And the congregation participates in the wider responsibilities of the church as arranged. So that's the general description of the congregation. Congregational meetings, we're required to have 2 each year. One is the AGM, when the audited financial statements are presented, when the church council is elected, and where representatives to Presbyterian Synod are elected. So that's important because this congregation has representatives to Presbyterian. I wonder who that might be. You've forgotten already, haven't you? Bill and Dorothea, and representatives to Synod. Elizabeth and Sharon are ministers in placement. They are both members of the Church Council and members of Presbytery, automatically. The Church Council is actually the council in the local area, which is charged with sharing with the minister or ministers in spiritual oversight of the congregation. And there's that phrase which appears a number of times in relation to congregation and church council. Build the congregation up in faith and love, sustain its members in hope, lead them into a fuller participation in Christ's mission in the world. So that's the high level responsibility of the church council. Members are elected by the congregation at a congregational meeting. Members must be confirmed members of the church. Men and women equally can serve as members on the church council. When you look at the photo behind you, that's the Tuggeranong Church Council. It's a large church council by comparison to others these days, but it contains office bearers and members of church council and elders. And the ministers in placement are automatically members of the church council and share in all the responsibilities that the church council has. So in the congregation, what we expect to see is pastoral care of the members, helping members to grow in faith and love, leading members in mission, sharing faith and service, arranging worship, managing finances, keeping records, keeping discipline, and managing property. So that's the sort of catch-all set of areas that a viable congregation needs to be actively doing. And in this congregation, there are people that are designated to take responsibility for a number of those areas, and there are more people that help assist in doing in carrying out those areas. As the church has shrunk over time, congregations have become smaller, and those willing and able, or able and willing to undertake these roles, have declined. So in some places, you will not see the full life of the congregation expressed in that way, which is one of the difficulties that we're facing with the church these days, this week. So that's one snapshot, as you know, of this congregation. You never get all of the congregation together at any one time, but that's one really good instance of the congregation, and a fairy that floated in as well. Do we have any questions about congregation at this point?
Can I just say one other thing, given the situation of this congregation, the congregation calls the new minister
Right, yeah.
into placement, that's their role, not the church council.
Yes. So just in case, yeah, that's probably a good point to pick up on, that the process for calling a new minister involves the appointment of a number of people from the congregation. The church council has appointed a number of people to a body called the Joint Nominating Committee. It's a joint nominating committee because it's joined to the presbytery. The presbytery elects 2 representatives to that.
And the synod.
And in our case, because of the growth grant, synod. So there's a synod rep, 2 presbytery reps, and 6, I think, congregational reps that have started conversing and will be meeting. And
the presbytery convenes, chairs the
presbytery convenes that. And then documentation is prepared, and that gets fed into the statewide process, and names get given to talk to that joint nominating committee. So they are acting on behalf of the congregation. When it gets to the point that the JNC believes there's somebody to call, and that person believes that God is calling them to this place, then the name and the particulars come to the congregation, and as a congregation, you decide that.
So do names come other states as well?
They can, yes. Yeah. So it is the congregation that has the say in that, not the church council. Okay. A little bit about worship. Worship can be in any language in a variety of styles. And I saw something a few years ago, I don't know how up to date it is, that worship takes place in the Uniting Church around Australia in 26 different languages. So when we're thinking of Islander, Asian, even African now, Middle Eastern groups that meet, they're Uniting Church congregations, but they're worshipping in their native language. And then they didn't have a figure for this, but as well as a number of Indigenous languages. So particularly in the top end, there are Indigenous communities that worship and that still speak their own First Peoples language, and they worship in that. So that's like a standard set of elements in the worship service. For baptism, baptism takes place in the congregation, can be a baptism of an adult or a baptism of a child. The church takes responsibility for the instruction and nurture of those who are baptized. So for children, that's traditionally been Sunday school or some kind of young people's activity. For adults who are baptized, the offering of Bible studies or discipleship groups. The Uniting Church permits baptism either by full immersion or by pouring. We don't quite like sprinkling. We like pouring, not sprinkling. But it can be either way. It can be in a church. It can be in another setting. But the expectation is that the congregation is an active participant in that service. So there are practices in some uniting churches, but particularly in other denominations of private baptism, baptisms in homes, baptisms in backyards, baptisms in the church where it's just for baptism. But the Uniting Church officially does not advocate for that. We expect that baptisms take place in the midst of the people of God, because the people of God, the congregation, taking responsibility for the people baptized, and the person being baptized is taking part in a community of faith. So it must be done in a Christian service of worship. We have a very firm rule about baptism only once. If you were done as a child, then you are baptized, even if you do not remember it. You cannot be rebaptized. You can reaffirm your baptism, and there's a particular liturgy for that. But we don't. We believe that if you're baptized once, God has acted, God has called you and claimed you, the Spirit has entered your life, and there you are. You may not realize it for 10, 50, 70. So the option is there for baptized children to affirm their faith in the series of confirmation, and there is an authorised service of baptism. And this must be done by a person who has been authorised by the presbytery to celebrate the baptism. Now, if you're an ordained person, you have the right to preside, to conduct that service of baptism. But we also have the provision in the Uniting Church for lay people, duly trained and recognised, trained by the presbytery and recognised by the congregation, for lay people to preside both at baptism and at communion. There are such people in our midst, even in this room, in this congregation. That arose in the 90s, like 30 years ago.
Oh, Bromwell Mitchell.
And Bromwell Mitchell, yeah. When increasingly rural congregations did not have a minister, could not afford a minister. But there were lay people who had lived their whole life in the church, so a training course was devised and they were recognised and authorised. And that has continued, and now it's spread through into urban as well as rural congregations. It's another question about which conversations with other denominations may be a little bit tricky, because there's some denominations are very strict about only the priest, only the minister can conduct communion and can baptise. And likewise, on the other side of things, there are services where anyone can hop up and lead a service of communion on any particular week without even a roster being formed. Yeah. So, communion, all baptised members can receive communion, and we have recognised long ago in the Uniting Church that this includes children. So we're not a denomination that says you need to get to a certain point before you can take part in communion. You are invited to be part of it. And although the basis of union says only baptised members, the practice in many places is anyone who's there who wants to. So nobody's checking your baptism certificate when you come up for communion.
No.
We can use one loaf, we can use little pieces of bread, we can have one cup, the common cup, we can have little glasses, we can have grape juice, we can have wine. That's all dependent upon local variation. There are guidelines that the Liturgy Commission has developed, but there are no requirements in the sense of the manner that it's to be distributed. There are different ways to serve. You can come forward, you can remain in your seat, you can sit, you can stand, you can kneel, depending on where you are, what the architecture of the church building is like. So we're very diverse from that point of view. There is an expectation that the elements that are left over will be disposed of respectfully. I can remember when I was a theological student going to a high Anglican church, sitting right up front, and there were more people in the service than they had realised. So they got to a certain point, and then they came out and broke some more bread and poured some more wine into the jug. But they actually poured too much, and there was, or maybe they did it deliberately, I don't know. And then it was all left over. But in that particular tradition, the priest had to consume everything. And so we sat there at the end while the guy had a nice little after. Sorry, it was a reverent Holy Communion service. Now, we don't do that in the Uniting Church necessarily. Some places do. And I remember when I was at, also again, when I was at Theological College, there was a bit of a debate one day about if we scatter the bread remains outside and they're eaten by the birds, is that respectfully disposing or not? And part of the argument is it's just throwing it on the ground, and another part of the argument was birds are God's creatures too. So
We place it on the table at morning tea at college now, and so it gets eaten with the hummus.
Yes, okay. Great. So again, there's an authorised service, or there's authorised variant services in the Uniting and Worship book, and this is to be done by a person authorised by the presbytery to celebrate, either an ordained person or a lay person authorised. So you can see that there are certain complexities in the life of a congregation that church council has to be aware of, that the ministers certainly need to be aware of, that don't necessarily hit you in the face Sunday by Sunday when you're coming and engaging in worship or when you're engaging in the mission activities of the church. But the church is an organisation. It's got its structure, it's got its rules, and they've developed over time. Now, presbytery. This is a regional meeting of congregations. Each congregation in the presbytery has at least one lay member, and if there are ministers in placement in the congregation, then that minister is also part of the presbytery. Presbyteries must meet at least twice a year. Most presbyteries seem to meet 4 times a year, every 3 months or so, which is a good pattern. Presbytery has oversight. Now, that doesn't mean, oh, whoops, I forgot about. I mean, when you get to the shop and you buy an oversight, you've left your shopping list at home. It's not that kind of oversight. It's the oversight of standing and looking out over and knowing what is happening and being involved. Oversight of the life and mission of the church within its boundaries, including oversight of all ministers and oversight of all congregations. So the presbytery is to encourage congregations to strengthen one another's faith, bear one another's burdens, exhort one another to fulfill their calling under Christ, encouraging them to participate in the wider work of the church. And for decades now, the Uniting Church has had presbytery staff. Now, in our presbytery, we have 2 administrative staff and 2 ministerial staff. Amy Juna, who was mentioned before, works part-time in the office. Andrew Smith, who many of you have met, is one of the presbytery ministers, and Liz McMillan is the other presbytery minister. They are there to serve and assist the congregations. Isn't that a nice line?
And this is what you used to do, isn't it?
That's what I used to do, serving and assisting. This is a map. Canberra Region Presbytery. There are a whole lot of congregations in Canberra that are just represented by the one blob on that map, and that's the list going from north to south, from Gungahlin through to Tuggeranong. There are also congregations at Queanbeyan, Goulburn, Crookville, Gunning, Yass, Cooma, Jindabyne, and then on the south coast, Bateman's Bay, Maruya, Narooma, Bega, Merimbula, and Eden. So you can see it's the ACT, which is more than half of the congregations, certainly more than half of the ministers and numbers of people, and then the surrounding area of New South Wales. It's that little bit on the map down there. So that's the area of oversight for the Canberra Region Presbytery. This is in our very own building. A number of ministers within that, and soon-to-be ministers in that in the presbytery, along with the principal of UTC, who came to preach. Up the top there, the current chairs of the presbytery: Ross Kingham, the retired minister, and Janet Kay. And in the middle there, the former chairpersons of the presbytery, John Williams from Kippax and Delia, of course, from here at Tuggeranong. This is the current staff and office bearers of the presbytery, and those that were in the building at the time. and Liz and Ross added in as well. So that's the admin. Oh, and Alicia wasn't there, but I
She was
didn't.
behind the camera.
Oh, right.
She deliberately put that.
Don't blame.
The presbytery is active, like this congregation is active. So they're members of the presbytery uniting for the common good, taking part in the Palm Sunday March, in gatherings on the lawn of Parliament House. So presbytery is active in that way, and that draws together ministers and members from around the presbytery to such events. So that's the presbytery. All right. Synod is a meeting of presbyteries. Now, that's what the regulations say. Each congregation has at least one lay member, but that's not right.
I think the way they administer that's changed.
Yeah. So presbyteries ask for nominations from the congregations within the presbytery, and then presbyteries are given, like we've got 30, I think.
Well, I think how it worked this time is that if there's a pro rata thing, and the synod pretty much told presbyteries what they were getting.
Right. Yeah.
We got that, and we were entitled to 34, 36.
The number of people attending the synod has decreased.
Yeah.
And that's been deliberate because of the expense and other things attached to that.
So this is like, if some of you may reflect back to your working life, this is like a statewide gathering of representatives from a particular form of job that you were doing. This is a statewide, largely a statewide gathering. Our synod currently meets every 18 months to 2 years. It's had to be a bit flexible about that because of COVID, but we are meeting next month. Synod has oversight of property and finance, church, schools, and uniting care or uniting agencies. And the map shows you, the map is inaccurate because the Western Australian Synod ends there. And so Broome and all of the places up there in the Kimberley belong to the Northern Synod, not the Northern Territory, the Northern Synod. And Victoria and Tasmania, a decade or so ago, merged to form one synod. And interesting quirks like Albury and Wodonga on either side of the they both belong to Victor. So Albury's in New South Wales, but belongs to the Victor Synod. And the same with up the Tocky Tweed Heads and Coolangatta Tweed Heads belongs to Queensland. So just a few little bits. And of course, we have the distinction in the ACT of providing the headache for the Synod of New South Wales, because it's the Synod of New South Wales and the ACT with two different sets of government regulations to worry about.
Is that synod, but they changed the name?
Synod has offices, doesn't it, the same as the presbytery?
Yeah, so presbytery offices are in Civic. The Synod offices are in Pitt Street in Sydney.
All right. And are they sort of active the way the presbytery is? They get involved in like like social justice things, like the presbytery. You mentioned the presbytery goes out and goes to protests.
The Synod has been very active in the areas of social justice to do with social housing and to do with climate and environment.
Also refugees.
And refugees, yeah. So, yeah, and there have been, I'm not sure whether they are Synod employers or uniting employees, but there have been people employed full time to focus on that kind of thing.
What's that point? Who oversees that?
Well, Nathan Tyson is employed by the Synod as the First Peoples officer, and I was just talking to him the other day, and he's feeling exhausted because he's going everywhere around the state. But yeah, so there is a person for that. Synod has general oversight, direction and administration of the church's worship, witness and service in the region allotted to it. This is
They lean into that general quite a lot.
This is a lawyer's delight because it's just so wide and broad that they can tell you to do anything now, can't they?
Well, I think they can.
That's a problem with the Uniting Church. We're top heavy.
So the regulations specifically have a lot of detail relating to mission of the church, theological and ministerial education, and property. And those of you on Church Council will know from Elizabeth's sagas about grant applications that the legal entity of the Uniting Church in each state is the property trust for that state or synod. And so all legal documents like contracts and agreements need to go through them.
And they own all the property legally.
Yeah, so this property, like every United Church property, is owned by the property trust of the Synod of New South Wales and the ACT. And we have what's called beneficial stewardship. So stewardship means we look after it, and beneficial means we get the benefits of being in the place and looking after it. We don't own
The
it.
benefits of rates, right? And
Yep,
electricity
the benefits
bills.
of all those things.
The benefit of
So that's the theme for the coming synod, Transforming Spirit, up the top. Going to be held for the first time at the Katoomba Christian Convention Centre. That's that.
It's straight like that.
Yeah. That down the bottom is the table we were at one of the synods that was held at Knox. It's 2019 or 20, I'm not sure. Yeah, so that's how synods operate. Sit around at tables, slightly bigger than this. You're in table groups, speakers up the front. You can have small group discussions at your table.
So do all the ministers from within the synod go to there?
No,
Now, they
no,
used to.
it used to be years ago.
So there's some ministers and also some lay people from.
Yes, yeah. So ministers and lay people. So ministers and lay people both have to nominate, say they're interested in going.
Oh, okay.
And I
And then
think-
who decides? The synod itself.
The presbytery decides. We're going as representatives of the presbytery.
Yeah. Okay, so
To form the synod. Yeah. So the
And you
presbytery.
have an allocated number that you can send.
Yes,
Yeah.
and it's got to be, there's allocations for young people, people of ministers, lay people, male, female, there's all these ratios.
So the process of how these larger gatherings work is what we're looking at in session 4 when we're looking at how does the Uniting Church make decisions and the manual for meetings. So I'm skipping over that element of it. You can see this is the assembly in 2015 in the University of Western Australia in Perth in their great hall. You can see that even in the Uniting Church, people worship with hands uplifted.
without getting there.
No, we were standing up doing something or other. I can't remember.
The red chairs.
So you can see that's people from all around Australia that have been sent from synods to the Assembly. Sharon Hollis is the current president of the Assembly until next year. Colleen Geyer is the General Secretary. The president is elected for a 3-year term. You're elected at this Assembly to become president in 3 years' time. So for 3 years, you are president-elect. Then you are president. You're paid for that. Then you are the immediate past president. You're still a member of the standing committee that oversees you.
That's not 9 years.
It's a 9-year commitment, 3 of which are paid, and the other 6 of which you undertake while you're doing whatever else you're doing.
So how often does assembly meet?
3 years.
Okay.
The General Secretary is a paid position who is appointed by the Assembly. So the former General Secretary is Terence Corkin, who's a member of this presbytery, who lives at Maruya, and he was Gen Sec for 15 years. Colleen has been about 6 years, I think, in the position. So the Assembly is the National Council of the Church, meeting once every 3 years. Next meeting next year. Presbyteries and synods appoint members. There are always representatives of the called communities, and I should have in here also, there are always members of the Uniting Aboriginal and Islander Christian Congress who are members. And in fact, in more recent years, the custom has developed of the President of the Assembly and the Chairperson of the Congress sitting together at the top table and like co-chairing the meeting of the assembly, or in the synod's case of the synod. Assembly, so I said at the beginning, each council has responsibility for particular areas. So assembly has determining responsibility for doctrine. So marrying people of the same gender, it was argued, is a matter of the doctrine of the church, which needs to be determined by the assembly. So that's why the assembly spent time in 2012 and then more time in 2015 and then almost all the time in 2018 discussing and finally deciding that matter. It has responsibility for standards of theological education. One of the, for a few years, I was a member of one of the working groups of the Assembly, which oversaw the national standards for theological education. So that is to ensure that ministers right across Australia, they don't do the same course, but they are trained to meet the same level of competencies in the different areas required. It's responsible for the administering for the admission of ministers from other churches. So we recognise and accept, particularly people from Islander or Asian areas that have been ordained in churches there, but have migrated to Australia or want to come to Australia to serve here, as well as people from the Baptist and the Anglican and maybe even the Catholic Church. We have people coming from those places. It has determining responsibility for relationships with other churches and indeed for relationships with other faith bodies. So Elizabeth was a member, and I was a member also of another working group from the Assembly, which met regularly with members of the Jewish community in Australia. So we met twice a year and had discussions about matters of mutual concern and interest. But we have relationships with quite a number of other churches around Australia, and also overseas mission in Pacific Island countries, in various Asian countries, in the Middle East, in Africa.
You might know part of that is Uniting World.
Uniting World, yeah. So they're the four areas in which we organise ourselves according to the regulations in order to participate in the mission of God in the world. The local area, congregation with the church council overseeing it. The regional area is presbytery. The state-based area, not exactly state, but pretty well related to state, the synod, and the national body, the assembly. That's the organisation of the uniting church, which now looks much clearer to you, doesn't it?